Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome for the first time in 19 months. I'm so glad to be together. Yep. I wear a mask. I'm comfortable wearing a mask. I will when I'm not talking. So welcome to this evening's presentation by Dr. Charles Kupchan entitled From Trump to Biden, Navigating Isolationist and Internationalist Traditions in U.S. Statecraft. This is our first person presentation, as I said, in 18 months, and we're happy to be back. So, and thank you for being at the vanguard of those who are. For those not present, if you get any questions, we will upload this presentation, Dr. Kupchan's presentation, to our YouTube in a couple days after Tim gets done recording it and looking at it and editing it and so forth. So it will be on our YouTube channel. And because it's been a while since we've been together, I'd like to remind our members and guests that the Savannah Council on World Affairs is a nonprofit, non-political organization. As stated in Article 2 of our bylaws, our purposes are to foster personal awareness of, broaden community interest in, and promote the study of international issues. The Savannah Council does not trend one way or the other. We seek to provide information, and then we all as members can make our own opinions about what we've heard and what we've learned. So next, what I'd like to do is to acknowledge our sponsors for this presentation, and if you've been with us for quite a while, you know Kreitz Auto Group is a continuing platinum sponsor of the Savannah Council for our 2021-2022 program, that is September through next May. Kreitz is our exclusive local dealer for Buick, GMC, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Sprinter vans, and thank you, Kreitz. We appreciate your support. Audiology and hearing services with patient care as a priority has an experienced team of doctors who use an evidence-based approach to testing and recommending the best health care available to meet the unique needs of every patient. Thank you for your support of our program, AHAS. And Four Seasons Travel, locally owned and operated, has operated as a full-service agency in Savannah for over 30 years, handling leisure, corporate, meeting, and group travel in the Savannah area and across the United States. So thank you for your support, Four Seasons Travel. Now, our speaker, Dr. Charles Kupchan, is a professor of international affairs at Georgetown University, and he's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Kupchan served as special assistant to the president and senior director for European affairs on the National Security Council in the Obama White House. He was also director for European affairs on the National Security Council during the first Clinton administration, and before that, he worked in the State Department and has been an assistant professor of politics at Princeton. Dr. Kupchan received a BA in East Asian Studies from Harvard and a Master of Philosophy and Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford. He's serving as a visiting scholar at Harvard and Princeton, as well as prestigious schools and centers in London, Paris, and Tokyo. Somehow, he's been able to write a number of books, one of which, Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World, we will hear about tonight. Now to his topic. You've seen the abstract, I hope. The United States is in the middle of an urgent and heated debate over the future of its engagement in the world. Our nation's mood toward engagement has swung one way and then the other over our history, and the pendulum continues to swing. Dr. Kupchan will examine the history of isolationist and internationalist traditions in the United States and how the Biden administration might proceed. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Kupchan for tonight's presentation. Dr. Kupchan, we're pleased to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the warm welcome. I, too, am making my post-pandemic debut in terms of public speaking, and I have to say it's good to see some real eyeballs. Zoom gets old, as probably all of you know, so I'm actually delighted to be out and about and able to talk to some real human beings, and look forward to the conversation that we're going to have this evening. Let me begin by giving you a quick overview of the argument that I'm going to make this evening, and then I'll spend the next 20 minutes or so drilling down. And the big argument that I want to put out there for debate is that the country has gone through a couple long eras in its statecraft, two to be precise. One that started in the founding days, 1789, and ran until Pearl Harbor. And this was, to oversimplify, but I don't think grossly, the era of isolation, in which the United States followed the dictum of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and other founders, who basically said that ambition abroad will come at the expense of liberty and prosperity at home. George Washington, in his farewell address, said, commercial connections with everybody, political connections with no one. And the founders counseled those who came after to focus on building a republic at home and to stay out of trouble abroad. And that is largely what we did from the beginning until Pearl Harbor, with a couple of detours that I'll talk about later. But the catchphrase of this period was no entangling alliances. Yes, we can trade. Yes, our diplomats will go abroad. Yes, we're culturally engaged in the world. But no, we will not be strategically engaged outside the motherland being North America. That came to a screeching halt, that era, on December 7, 1941, with Pearl Harbor, when we really swung to the opposite extreme. And during the first period, American exceptionalism led to the belief that the United States needed to perfect its union. It could change the world by being an exemplar, by setting an example. But we couldn't let a corrupt and dangerous world spoil us. Rather, a more perfect union would go out and change the world. Well, after Pearl Harbor, the dominant narrative was that American exceptionalism requires us to go out and change the world in a more activist way. And so from Pearl Harbor until the Trump era, I think this was the era of American internationalism, in which we built 700 to 800 bases around the world, in which if there was a problem, a financial crisis, a geopolitical crisis, a humanitarian crisis, it was us that would send out the fire truck. That's the world that most of us know. That's the America that we grew up in. I came of age before the Berlin Wall came down. I went to graduate school in the 1980s. I lived and breathed Pax Americana. And so on January 20th, 2017, when Donald Trump announced in his inaugural address, from this day forward, it's America first, it's only America first, and I was working on this book, my head kind of exploded. Because what was America first? It was the mantra of the America First Committee, founded in 1940 to make sure that the United States remained isolationist. And many of us understood the Trump era to be some kind of bolt from the blue, to be un-American. Well, it was very American. The unilateralism, the isolationism, the hostility toward immigrants, all of that was part and parcel of American statecraft from 1789 to 1941. So Trump was not some guy who landed from another planet. He was tapping into a strain in American history, American political culture, American identity that was alive and well in many parts of the country, particularly in the parts of the country that we now call quote-unquote red. And so he was in many respects responding to what I would call a primal scream in the American electorate, reacting against the internationalism of the previous era. And that scream was basically, too much world, not enough America, what about us? Why don't we build schools in Kansas rather than in Kandahar? Why are we investing in other people's problems when we should be fixing our own problems? And this was, in many respects, I think, a legitimate, and in fact, I would go so far as to say that Trump was an astute, effective politician. He was tapping into very clear discontent with the American Pax Americana that we had built after World War II. My main critique of Trump is that he overcorrected. Instead of saying, I hear you, I understand that we're trying to turn Afghanistan and Iraq into Ohio and it's not working and we need to get out, he slammed on the brakes. And he pulled out of every agreement he could find. He turned his back on our allies. He insulted key friends and partners. In fact, he took a wrecking ball to the world that America made after World War II, rather than trying to modify and reform it in a way that would again win the support of the American electorate. So I see Trump as someone who understood that the domestic foundations of American foreign policy had cracked, but didn't come up with very good solutions on how to solve the problem. In fact, in some respects, made it even worse. Biden, in my mind, is the person who has to try to correct for Trump's overcorrection, who can't take us back to the good old days of the Cold War or the 1990s, the so-called end of history, because that's not where we are. We're no longer in a world in which the United States enjoys the kind of ideological and material predominance that it once did. We will soon be in a world, I'm guessing within 5 to 6 years, in which the world's largest economy will be that of China, in which the world's leading economic power will not be a democracy. That's revolutionary. That's a big deal. And we can talk later about what that means. But I think what Biden needs to do is find the middle ground between doing too much, which is where we were before, what the American people responded against, and doing too little and pulling back from a globalized world, which is what I think Donald Trump was doing, to find that sweet spot, to step back without stepping away. Is that going to be hard? You bet. Are people going to scream bloody murder? Yes. How do we know? Because Biden just said, we're done in Afghanistan. We pulled out. The Taliban are taking over. Our allies are saying, what the hell's going on here? But he did the right thing. And it's a courageous thing to do, and it's a hard thing to do. And as I'll come to in a minute, I think he's doing it because he understands that for now, the first priority has to be here in the United States. That rebuilding the domestic foundations of American foreign policy means rebuilding America's political class, reconnecting the American electorate to American engagement abroad. So let me back up a little bit and quickly run through these two long eras in American foreign policy that I've portrayed, and then end with some thoughts on both the Trump era and what lies ahead for the Biden presidency. As I said, American exceptionalism before Pearl Harbor meant very different things than it does today. Isolationism came in many different flavors, but it ruled the roost. Today, if you're an isolationist, you're a whack job. Isolationism is a pejorative. It's an insult. For most of American history until Pearl Harbor, the internationalists were the whack jobs. And that's because there was a consensus in this country that we should, as John Quincy Adams put it in 1823, go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And that view enjoyed political dominance across the aisle for the better part of 130 years, right up until 1898. And it enjoyed such political dominance because it had different ideological flavors. The Northeast was largely pacifist and didn't want to engage in great power rivalry because it didn't believe in war. The South was largely libertarian, and it didn't want to engage in great power rivalry because it was afraid that a standing army and a standing navy would be turned against the American people. A third variant of isolationism was about racism. We kept trying to invade and annex Canada. Most people don't know this, but we tried 3 times to invade and annex Canada. And then in 1867, after we won, the North won the war against the South, we asked the British for compensation because the British were providing warships to the Confederacy. And we said to the British, we want Canada in return for this. So we kept trying to get Canada. Why? Because it was full of white people. Some attempts were made to annex Cuba, Haiti, Santo Domingo, the West Indies, Hawaii, and they were all shot down. Partly for strategic reasons, but partly because there wasn't a consensus in this country to bring more non-whites into the body politic. So isolationism had a nativist variant of it as well. And then finally there was geography. And in some ways, the United States is exceptional not just because of its Republican roots, because of its commitment to liberty, but because we are isolated. 3,000 miles of ocean on one side, 5,000 miles of ocean on the other side, nice neighbors to the north and south, and as George Washington put it in his farewell address, why quit our own to stand upon foreign ground? Let's bank on our natural security. Unlike Europe, where everybody lives cheek by jowl and nation is pushing up against a nation, here, nobody's pushing up against us. Yes, there were Native Americans, but they weren't part of the American experiment, and as a consequence, they were pushed out of the way as we expanded westward and built a union and created a North American continent where we faced no challengers. And so American strategy over the course of the 19th century was essentially to pacify, tame, democratize, and Christianize North America, to drive European powers out of the Western Hemisphere, and to call it a day. And we made it. That's exactly what happened. American grand strategy of isolationism over the course of the 19th century was a smashing success. The United States emerged in unmolested fashion pushed European powers out of our neighborhood and said, we're done. However, the story starts to change in the 1890s, in part because we made it. We've arrived. We've made it to the Pacific coast. We dominate the Western Hemisphere. And that then led to a new narrative, which is, well, if we've made it to this frontier, what's the next frontier? What's going to keep the American experiment alive? Where is the dynamism going to come from? Where's the new market? And it was the idea of the closing of the frontier in the 1890s that led to a new narrative, that led the American government to start building battleships, and that led in 1898 to the Spanish-American War, in which President McKinley said to the American people, it's time to take manifest destiny on the road. It's time to go out and change the world, not just by example, but by our force. And so we kicked the Spanish out of Cuba, but went on to colonize Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Hawaii, Guam, the Wake Islands, and Samoa. And all of a sudden, in 1899, 1900, the American public woke up and said, whoa, 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 whoa. You told us we were taking manifest destiny on the road, and we were going to defeat Spanish imperialism in Cuba, and now we're imperialists? We're fighting an insurgency in the Philippines? No, thank you. That's not what we bargained for. And that reaction against the imperial moment cleared the way for the interwar retreat, the 1920s and 1930s, which was in some ways the darkest era of isolationism, in which the reaction against an effort to become an internationalist power was so severe that throughout the 1930s, we watched idly as Nazism and fascism swept Europe and East Asia. 80% of the American public in 1941 was opposed to entry into the war. The America First Committee that formed in 1940, which Donald Trump was hearkening back to in his inaugural speech, had chapters all over the country, very prominent individuals, Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, many modern politicians, including, I believe, Kennedy, Johnson, and others, gave money to the America First Committee. Isolationism continued to rule until we got attacked in Pearl Harbor. Had the Japanese not attacked Pearl Harbor, we probably would have never entered World War II. There wasn't a consensus to go to war. The Japanese did attack. The America First Committee disbanded on December 8th, 1941. The declaration of war passed with, if I recall correctly, one negative vote from a Republican pacifist woman from somewhere in the Midwest, I can't remember what state. In other words, the country rallied behind Roosevelt and the war. Come on, one more. And that really was the beginning of the internationalism that all of us have lived through. Or at least most of us have lived through, because I do see, fortunately, some younger people who weren't alive when the Berlin Wall fell down. So I'm going to skip over that era because a lot of us know about it, a lot of us lived through it, a lot of us know America as a country that was out there manning the barricades, putting out the fires, keeping troops in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, this was the era in which American exceptionalism meant America as the indispensable nation, America that would always go out and solve the problems of the world. Well, as I said, that era came to an end with Trump. I think it began to come to an end earlier. It was Obama, after all, who ran for re-election on a bumper sticker that said, "It's time for nation building here at home." And I think the story is not just about the reaction to the wars that came after 9/11. It is also about the ideological overreach of the United States and its liberal partners at the end of the Cold War, when Frank Fukuyama and others told us that history had come to an end and that we were witnessing the universalization of American democracy and American liberalism. And we flung open the doors of the West. We brought Russia into the G7 and turned it into the G8. We brought China into the WTO. We said free trade for everybody. Then 9/11 comes along, and we start trying to bring democracy to the Middle East. And lo and behold, we wake up and Americans are saying, what the hell's going on here? Why are we trying in this endless way to turn Afghanistan into an American-style democracy? It's not working. And that really is the turn back away from liberal internationalism that I think Trump represented. And as I said, I think he got it right. I think that Trump, you may like him, you may not like him, but he was an astute politician who was listening to and tapping into a very powerful current in the American electorate that wanted to see less world and more America. And as I said, this is not new in American history. I'll just tell you a few quick stories to give you some sense as to the degree to which Trump's isolationist and unilateralist inclinations have deep historical roots. Just a couple quick stories. 1778. We are, to put it nicely, getting our butts kicked by the British. The founders didn't want to get help from anybody, but they said, we either lose the Revolutionary War or we fashion an alliance with France. Out of pragmatism, we fashioned an alliance with France. The French duly sent over ships, arms, troops, money. In fact, someone told me last night that Lafayette and Washington stood on some porch in Savannah.
Just Lafayette, not Washington.
Just Lafayette. Okay. And so that all goes back to the French alliance. And thank goodness we won. Otherwise, we'd all be speaking with British accents and subjects of the Queen today. And then we start life as an independent nation. A few years later, 1793, war breaks out between Britain and France. The French pick up their cell phone and they call George Washington and they say, Georges, remember the alliance of 1778? Help us. How many ships, troops, how much money are you sending? Help us. What does George Washington do? He delivers the Proclamation of Neutrality. It's one of the most egregious acts of perfidy in American history. I'm guessing most of you don't know about it because we don't talk about it in polite company. But Washington declared neutrality in the face of an existing alliance commitment to the French that had just enabled us to acquire independence. Why did he do it? Because he said, we don't want alliances, we don't want entanglement, it's not in our interest. Good night and good luck. Best of luck to you. Does anyone know the next time the United States concluded a military alliance? After World War II. 1793, we reneged on an existing alliance, and we didn't form another one until after World War II. That gives you some sense as to the nature of the attachment to, hey, this is not our problem. We are staying out of this. And I'll give you one other example. The debate in 1919 and 1920 about the League of Nations. We had just won World War I. Wilson had told the American people we were saving the world for democracy. He goes over to Paris and he negotiates the Versailles Treaty. The Versailles Treaty contains the Covenant of the League of Nations, which is a global pact for democratic states to come together to resist aggression. He succeeds, they write it, the Europeans love it, he brings it back here, he takes it to the Senate. 3 times the Senate votes no. Twice in 1919, once in 1920. Wilson says, well, I might not have been able to convince the Senate, but I'm going to convince the American people. And so he calls the election of 1920 a referendum on American internationalism. And he anoints the governor of Ohio, James Cox, as the Democratic candidate to stand for Wilsonian internationalism and an America that goes out and fights aggression and stands for democracy. Well, what happens? The Republican candidate, Senator Warren Harding, says, I stand for the policies of George Washington. We, as Americans, do not form entangling alliances. Warren Harding wins that election in the most lopsided contest in American history. And that's the beginning of the 1920s and the 1930s, when we retreat to hemispheric isolation. One final anecdote to give you some sense of Trump's historical resonance. Isolationism, as I mentioned, often comes with anti-immigrant and anti-non-white sentiment. What happened just after Congress rejected the League of Nations? They passed the 1924 Immigration Act. What did the 1924 Immigration Act do? Bar not just non-whites, non-Anglo-Saxons. Immigration of Jews and Catholics to this country fell by 90%. My family is from Ukraine, of Jewish extraction. I have many more cousins in Mexico than I do here. Why? Because my grandfather made it in 1921, sent money back to get to the rest of the family out. They didn't get out till 1924, too late. So they all had to go to Mexico. 1 million Mexicans of American descent, Americans of Mexican descent were deported in the 1930s. Forcibly deported to Mexico. Citizens. That just gives you some sense of the degree to which Trump wasn't some bolt from the blue. He was in many respects tapping into these deeper traditions in American history and in the American narrative. Let me conclude by saying a few things about where we are today. As I said, I think Trump went too far. And we can talk later if you want to about other aspects of him, his approach to the rule of law. I won the election, I didn't win the election, I contest the election, blah, blah, blah. But the bottom line is that when it comes to internationalism, he tried to take us back to a kind of isolationism that is not possible in today's world. Almost everything we want to do as a nation requires help from others. The pandemic, climate change, nuclear proliferation, Iran, North Korea. We can't solve North Korea without the help of the Chinese. We can't solve Iran without the help of Russia and China. They're members of the Security Council. In other words, we are deeply tethered into a world that is globalized and interdependent in an irreversible way. And as a consequence, I think we need to find a way of engaging in that world in a manner, in a fashion that is able to reconnect with the American electorate and rebuild support for American internationalism. Otherwise, I do fear we will go back to some sort of knee-jerk isolationism. And let's be honest, Trump's approach to these issues won a lot of support. He was almost reelected. He got 74 million votes. He could be the next president of the United States. So, 4 quick final points. What do I think Biden should do to find that new sweet spot? To navigate between the isolationist and internationalist traditions and to keep the United States in a world in which we have to be engaged because we don't have an option. 1, focus on the home front. If you were to ask me, what do I think the 2 most important foreign policy initiatives are? I would say they're not foreign policy initiatives. They're investments in the American people. They're investments in infrastructure, in our roads, in our healthcare systems. They're investments in rebuilding America's political center. Because that was really the magic that enabled FDR to do what he did. He was building the political center on the back of the New Deal. He was tapping into the rising prosperity of Northerners, of Southerners, of whites, of blacks, to build political centrism and political moderation. And it was that sweet spot in the middle of the political spectrum that allowed liberal internationalism to take root, that allowed us to be a country that was strong at home and therefore strong abroad. Good policy requires good politics. And right now, we don't have good politics. We have a country that is deeply dysfunctional politically. And as someone, and maybe this makes me a Marxist, I think at root, it's the economy, stupid. And we need to make sure that Americans across the country are earning a living wage. 1 quick factoid. 30, 40 years ago, the largest employer in the United States was GM. The average wage of a GM worker in current dollars was $30 an hour. Today, the largest employer in the United States is Walmart. I haven't checked for a couple of years, but the last time I checked, the average wage of a Walmart worker was $8 an hour. I don't know about you, I can't live off $8 an hour. I don't think anybody can live off of $8 an hour, especially if you have a family. That, to me, is the root of the political dysfunction that we are facing today. We need to solve it. We don't solve that problem, we're not going to solve our political problem. We don't solve the political problem, we're never going to be able to deal with the rise of China. They'll clean our clock. Second point, we need to reset our geopolitical priorities. Get out of the strategic periphery where we have been spinning our wheels and focus again on the big geopolitical issues of stability in Eurasia, Russia and China in particular. But the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, they just really have produced little of good. And I think it's far more important for us to focus on the major powers And then the new non-traditional security issues that, if we're not careful, will come to bite us in the rear end. Cybersecurity. And in general, the whole digital economy. The pandemic, look, we're all wearing our masks. Not me, but I'll put it back on in a second. Climate change. These are in many respects much, much more threatening to the lives of Americans than the Taliban. Third, the rise of China. This is something that we as a nation have never confronted. The Soviet Union topped out at 55% of American GDP. China's GDP will soon surpass ours. They are a full-service superpower. In AI, artificial intelligence, in quantum computing, in science and technology, they're climbing. We're fine. We're doing very well. Silicon Valley is great. Google and Intel and Microsoft, you name it, our high-tech companies are at the top of the pack. But theirs are doing pretty good. You've probably heard of Alibaba. You've probably heard of Tencent. You've probably heard of a lot of other Chinese companies. Have you ever heard of a Russian company other than oil and gas? No. And that's because Russia is a gas station with nuclear weapons. China is not. And it has 1.4 billion people. What do we do about it? I don't know. I think it is in some respects the $6 million question of the day. And the answer is not throw the book at them. It can't be. Why? Because China is everywhere. Who's Germany's largest investor? Germany. China, right? We, after Mexico and Canada, one of our largest trading partners is China. They're all over Africa. So we can't put the genie back in the bottle. We have to find a way of both engaging China and pushing back against China. And I don't think we've found out how to find the right balance. I don't have the answer, but it seems to me it's one of the great challenges of the day. Final point. Ideology. I think the United States has gone from, we're an exceptional nation, we don't want to dilute or adulterate our experiment by venturing out into a spoiled and corrupt world. That didn't work so well. So then we decided we were going to go out and transform the world to make it safe for American engagement. And now I think we might need to find a way of neither recoiling from a world that isn't necessarily moving in the American direction, nor go out there and try to change it, because that could be a bridge too far. And so unlike Biden, who portrays this era as a defining clash between democracy and autocracy, I think one of our great challenges today is to find a way of working across ideological dividing lines. We need to find a way to talk to the Chinese about climate change, about trade, about human rights, about the pandemic. Because if we don't, we're not going to be able to solve those problems. And so I'm someone who thinks that in the end of the day, democracy will win. Democracy will prevail. But not because we beat the others, not because we defeat the others, but because we show that our system outperforms the alternatives. And that's why I think my final message would be, right now, our main task is here at home. Our first, second, third, and fourth priorities has to be to fix the American economy and the American political system. Then I am confident we will prevail against autocratic alternatives. But strength abroad starts with strength at home. right now, rebuilding strength at home has to be our focus. Thank you.
Okay, I think that does work. Great. Thank you for an outstanding, wide-ranging presentation, history lesson, and I could hear comments at different point about saying, you know, like, yeah, whatever. That's why we're here. Thank you. So now it's time for questions. Do we have anybody who has a question right now? Yes, hang on. Pardon me if you would. What I'd like to say is, when you ask your question, I'll come back there, but this does not transmit to our recording, so Dr. Kupchan is going to repeat your question, okay, assuming that he can. Right now.
Sir, you concluded with a statement that in the final analysis, democracy must prevail. Democracy where, would be my question.
The question was that I concluded by saying democracy will prevail. The answer is where. The question is where. Do I believe in American exceptionalism? Yes. And to me, that means that on balance, the United States has pushed history in a positive direction. Since we came around as a nation, we have made the world a little bit more free, a little bit more dignified, more prosperous, less war, more safe. And so in that regard, I think history has moved in a more democratic direction with the help of the United States. Have we made mistakes? Yes, plenty. Now, to some extent, that experiment has stalled. It is in trouble today in a way that I never thought imaginable. And I don't want to get partisan here, because you said you're nonpartisan and nonprofit. I've been scared. I've been really scared for the last 4 years, right? And that's because I feared for the fate of American democracy. I think we came about this close. And to have the world's leading democracy come close to a heart attack is a big deal. And that's why I think right now we need to man the barricades at home. We need to fix the problems that have led to this political dysfunction and this level of polarization. We just don't, at this point, have the luxury of going and doing it for Libya, or and my best luck to Libya, but that's not our priority right now. Final point would be: do I think that ultimately democracy is going to spread to places where it does not exist? Yes, I do. And that's because I think that in the end of the day, humans crave dignity and respect. I just think it's going to take a very long time, as in centuries. And that we as Americans had better be patient.
As we know today, China has taken on an impressive initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative. Can you think of a comparable initiative that the United States could take in this potential collision with China?
The question is, China is undertaking the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a vast infrastructure investment project concentrated to some extent on Eurasia, connecting China to Europe, but also there are maritime aspects through the Indian Ocean, through the Middle East, So it's really huge. I don't think you could find a part of the world today where the Chinese aren't pushing in, including, by the way, in the Arctic, which is making the Russians quite uncomfortable. But to your question, sir, I think about China today in a way that is quite similar to the United States in the 19th century, in that the Chinese are actually very unilateralist. They don't have a single alliance. They have a partnership with Russia, and that's it, just like we did in the 19th century. The leading edge of their engagement is commercial, not military. They have one overseas military base, and it's in Djibouti, which is in Eastern Africa. In other words, they're following our playbook. We didn't have alliances. We expanded commercially, but not militarily. And then at the end of the 19th century, the light bulb went on, and Americans said, hey, we're now the big kid on the block. We need a geopolitical ambition equal to our economic power. That's where the Chinese are today. The light bulb was going on. Xi Jinping is kind of beating his chest and saying, okay, we've arrived. Is there an American counterpart to Belt and Road? No. No, there isn't. Will there be? No. There will not be. Why? Because we can't even take a train from here to anywhere. Right? If you land at the airport in Shanghai, you can get on a maglev, a magnetic levitated train to get into downtown Shanghai. You take the train from Washington to New York, you're lucky if it makes it. Right? In other words, we don't have the luxury of going out and building highways and ports throughout Africa because we have to build them here. And so quite frankly, you know, some of you may remember at the G7, Biden said, we are going to create a competitor to Belt and Road. My response, really? Where are you going to get the money? So for right now, there's one game in town in many parts of the world, and that's China. And that's something that we need to reckon with.
How do you account for our entry into World War I? We weren't attacked, and Wilson ran for re-election on a campaign of staying out of the war.
The question is, how did we get into World War I, especially after Wilson campaigned on a platform of staying out? Very good question. Most of you probably don't know this, but Wilson was an isolationist and an imperialist. American policy in the Western Hemisphere under Wilson was as interventionist as under any president. So he talked the talk of being the son of, I think he was a Presbyterian minister, and peace and love and happiness, but he sure as hell was trundling around Latin America. When it came to Europe, though, and when the war broke out in 1914, he said, we don't have a dog in this fight. This is not our problem. And he attributed moral equivalence to France and Britain on one side and Germany on the other, saying they're all a bunch of crazy realpolitik. You know, the Europeans they fight each other all the time. That's just what they do. And so from 1914 until the early part of 1917, we stayed on the sidelines. Then Germany began to sink American ships that were crossing the Atlantic. And Wilson said, this is not just a threat to American lives, it's a threat to American honor, and it's a threat to neutrality. Because the laws of neutrality held that non-belligerents should be able to freely trade. And we were a non-belligerent. But the Germans said, no, you're sending all of this support to the British. It's going to tilt the balance toward them. We're going to start sinking your ships. But then interestingly, and I would encourage you all of you to read Wilson's request for a declaration of war in April, I think it was April 6, 1917. He said, we're going to war to save democracy. We're going to war with no whiff of national interest. This is all about humanity. It was the most idealistic speech in American history of going to war. I mean, we always say some of that, but this was pure idealism. And he got a good, strong vote. I think there were roughly 50 no votes in the House, very few in the Senate. And so we go to war, we win the war, but Americans turned against it because they said, saving the world for democracy? Where our kids are getting gassed. Right? This is just another European bloodletting. And it's that reaction that really did help deepen the isolationism of the interwar period. There was a senator named Nye, I think he was from North Dakota, who formed an inquest into the causes of World War I. And that congressional committee concluded that the United States was taken to war by the military-industrial complex against its national interests. And we then began to pass in 35, 36, and 37 neutrality laws that prevented Americans from trading with any belligerent anywhere because of a fear of a repeat of World War I. In fact, one of the things that turned Roosevelt against neutrality is that we embargoed arms sales to anybody, even the good guys. So in the Spanish Civil War, the fascists were supporting Franco. We were giving nothing to the Spanish Republicans. We embargoed them. And Roosevelt said, this makes no sense. Why aren't we helping the good guys? And that's when he began to try to fight against neutrality.
If we could, Dr. Kupchan, one last question.
Can you paint us a picture of a future America if Donald Trump is reelected? And also, whose radio show are you going to be on tomorrow?
Is there any whiskey here? You know, what most frightened me about the Trump era was not the policy. As I said, I think in some respects he was an astute politician. What most concerned me was the disregard for the rule of law and the disregard for a democratic debate based upon any resemblance of factual material, right? And when a country slips into competing narratives, some of which have no foundation in reality, then you're in deep trouble. And I'll say something, and this will be not kind, but you know, I always, when I would read history, I would sort of read the history of the 1920s and the 1930s, and I would say to myself, how did this happen? You know, Berlin, the most sophisticated city perhaps in the world, the most educated, middle class, wealthy, scientists, literature. How did they ever lose their minds? And having lived through the Trump era, I think we got a glimpse. We got a glimpse of how liberal democracy can lose it. Right? Because we were, you know, thank God the system worked. Thank God the courts functioned. You know, this is a controversial subject, so I probably shouldn't venture in this, but thank God the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff called the Chinese chief of staff and said, we're a little screwed up over here, chill out. Right? I don't even know if that's legal, right? That's not in the civilian control of the military. But, we had a commander-in-chief whose own staff thought that he had lost his marbles. That's what scared me so much. I actually don't think that he's going to be reelected. But I do think that the politics that he represents are alive and well. And that we are not out of the woods as a nation. And that's why, if you take one point away from our gathering tonight, this is where we have work to do. Right? If we don't repair the country from the inside out, all this talk about China and Russia and foreign policy, it's just going to amount to a hill of beans. If we get it right at home, I'm confident we'll get it right abroad. If we get it wrong at home, no chance in hell are we going to get it right abroad.
Great. When I say great, I mean the presentation, the extemporaneous answers to questions across the spectrum. Thank you. So this concludes our program. Thank you again, Dr. Kupchan. Excellent. So happy we have you here with us this evening. We're appreciative of your thoughts on isolationist and internationalist trends in the United States and how the Biden administration, some of the issues that it might face, as well as a couple thoughts on how they might proceed. We wish you the very best in your future efforts. I understand you don't have a book yet in your future that you're looking at, but I want to add that Dr. Kupchan's books are available online as well as in our local bookstores. So, in conclusion, just in case you missed what fell down. Okay. Yeah. My wife did she's not here right now, so she won't know that her effort's on the ground right now. Our next program is scheduled for October 21st, and our speaker will be Dr. John Denny of the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, whose topic will be, and it's the title of his book, Coalition of the Unwilling and Unable, European Realignment and the Future of American Geopolitics. So with that, I wish you all a good evening. Thank you for joining us. We'll hope to see you all again at 7:30 p.m. right here on October 21st. Thank you again.